Ah, this is wonderful. To good friends and great wine. Cheers.
She walked into that dinner as a guest at her own table, no title on her name card, no seat at the center, just a wine-red dress and 14 months of work they were about to celebrate without her name on it, and she sat down, smoothed her dress, and waited. Because Adaeze Chukwu had always known something her ex-husband had not figured out yet. Power does not announce itself, it arrives. The pearls were the thing that did it, her pearls, the ones his mother placed around her neck on their wedding morning, now fastened around the throat of a woman who did not know what they cost. Sitting beside a man who had forgotten what it meant to lose something irreplaceable, and Adaeze looked at them once, looked away, and picked up her water glass like she was simply waiting for the storm she had already called in. Nobody at that table knew that the quiet woman at the far end had already made 3 phone calls, signed 2 documents, and restructured the entire equity split of the joint venture they were about to toast. They were raising glasses to a deal that now belonged entirely to her husband's firm, and her ex-husband was smiling like a man who had no idea the floor had already been pulled from under him. The pearls were the thing that did it. Adaeze saw them the moment she walked in, her pearls, the ones Mother Kwan had fastened around her neck herself on the morning of the wedding, whispering in Korean that a woman who carries herself quietly carries everything. Now sitting against the collarbone of a woman who did not know what they had cost, clasped around the throat of someone who had not earned them, glowing soft and ivory under the private dining room's warm chandelier light like they had always belonged there, like Adaeze had never existed. She looked at them for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away, pulled out her chair at the far end of the table, the seat by the kitchen doors, the seat that smelled like dish soap and the ghost of someone else's pepper soup, sat down, smoothed the front of her wine-red dress, and picked up her water glass like she was simply waiting. Like she had not spent 14 months building the deal they were about to toast. Like her name card did not read simply Adaeze with no title, no hyphenated surname, nothing. Like someone had quietly decided she was decoration tonight rather than architecture. She waited. 0. If you have ever been the most dangerous person in a room that refused to see you, do not move, because what happens in the next few minutes will rearrange everything you thought you understood about patience, about power, and about what it really means when a woman who has swallowed her rage finally decides she is done swallowing. And if you are new here, subscribe right now, because we do not tell stories about women who stay broken on this channel. We tell stories about women who wait, and then we show you what the waiting was for. Kwon Suk-jin was at the head of the table. Of course he was. He had always known how to occupy the head of things, the head of the table, the head of the room, the head of a conversation that everyone else thought they were leading. He was in a charcoal suit with a brushed gold tie pin, the one Adaeze had bought him in Jeju on his 38th birthday, the one he had unwrapped with both hands because his mother raised him to treat gifts like scripture. He was laughing. The kind of laugh that made other men sit up straighter without knowing why. The kind of laugh that had once made Adaeze fall in love with him across a boardroom in Lagos 7 years ago when he was just the Korean venture partner her father's company was courting, and she was just the chief strategy officer who was supposed to be invisible. She had never been invisible. That had always been the problem. The woman beside him was named Yoon Charan, 29. The kind of face that existed perfectly in photographs and the kind of laugh that only ever appeared in response to whoever was speaking beside her. She touched Suk-jin's arm when she laughed. She leaned close when he whispered. She was wearing the pearls and she had no idea what she was wearing, and that more than the seat, more than the name card, more than the fact that Suk-jin had not looked once in Adaeze's direction since she arrived, that was the thing that had settled into Adaeze's chest like a coal that refused to go cold. Park Juno leaned over from the seat to her left. He was the CFO of the Seoul branch, a man who had once described Adaeze in a board meeting as the most precise strategic mind he had encountered in 20 years of finance. And he was now looking at her with the face of a man who has only recently understood the size of the mistake he allowed to happen. The seating arrangement, he said quietly, was not my decision. I know, Adaeze said. It came from Juno. She did not look at him. I know where it came from. She had seen the original chart. Her name at the center. Adaeze Chukwu, Chief Strategy Officer, bracketed by the two senior board members who had flown in from Lagos, positioned exactly where the architecture of the evening demanded she sit, because she had designed the architecture. She had written the agenda. She had drafted the joint venture terms across 9 months of back and forth between Seoul and Lagos, had flown that route 4 times in 1 quarter, had sat in rooms where men spoke Korean around her, and then looked surprised when she responded in Korean. Had built this deal from a handshake between 2 old men into a $47 million co-investment structure that both families were about to sign. And then 3 days ago, someone had quietly redrawn the seating chart, moved her to the end, stripped her name down to nothing, given her seat at the center to Choyeon, who had contributed to this deal in no capacity that Adaeze could identify beyond existing attractively beside the man who had once been Adaeze's husband. She had found out from Juno's assistant, who had sent the new chart by mistake to an old email thread that still included Adaeze's personal address. She had sat with that information for 72 hours. She had made 3 phone calls. She had signed 2 documents. She had gotten dressed, done her hair, driven herself to the restaurant, found her seat at the end of the table, and sat down. And now she was waiting. The dinner moved the way these dinners always moved, too much wine too early, the kind of conversation that sounds like substance and contains mostly performance, men laughing at things that were not funny because the most powerful man in the room had laughed first. Seokjin toasted the partnership. He thanked the Hanwol executives. He mentioned the Lagos office. He did not mention Adaeze. Juno watched her face during the toast. Her face did not move. Choyeon said something to Seokjin that made him smile, a private smile, the tucked-in one he used when he was genuinely amused rather than publicly performing amusement. And Adaeze recognized that smile the way you recognize a song that used to be yours and now plays in someone else's house, and she took a long, slow breath and put her water glass down and checked her phone under the table. The message read, "We are outside. Say the word." She typed back, "Not yet." Then she put her phone away and picked up her fork and ate her starter like a woman who had nowhere to be and nothing to prove and all the time in the world, which is the most dangerous way a woman can eat. Seokjin finally looked at her at 8:23 p.m. It was an accident. She could tell by the way his eyes moved, the quick involuntary sweep of the table that his gaze did every few minutes out of old habit, and then they snagged on her and stopped. She watched him process it. The wine-red dress, the edges, the posture, the fact that she was here at all, which he had clearly not anticipated, because whoever redesigned that seating chart had perhaps assumed that a woman moved to the end of her own table would simply not come. He looked away first. She had expected that. What she had not expected was Choyeon. The younger woman had tracked Seokjin's gaze and found its endpoint, and now she was looking at Adaeze with the particular expression of someone who has heard a description of a person and is now meeting them and finding that the description was inadequate. Choyeon leaned towards Seokjin and said something quiet. Seokjin's jaw tightened. He shook his head slightly. Juno, beside Adaeze, exhaled slowly. "You should know," he said, without looking at her, "that what he said about you at last month's internal review." Juno. It was not appropriate. Several of us said so. What did he say? A pause. That the emotional volatility you demonstrated during the divorce proceedings raised questions about your fitness for senior strategic roles. The table was loud enough that nobody else heard this. Adaeze set her fork down with the careful precision of a woman setting down something much heavier than a fork. Emotional volatility. She had cried once, in a conference room, after 3 consecutive days of mediation in which Seokjin's legal team had systematically contested every asset she had brought into the marriage independently, including the consulting firm she had built before she ever met him. She had cried, quietly, with her hand over her mouth, for approximately 90 seconds. Then she had washed her face, gone back into the room, and restructured her entire counterproposal from scratch in a way that his lawyers had not seen coming. Emotional volatility. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Adaeze. "Thank you, Juno. I mean that." She picked her fork back up. She finished her starter. She was absolutely, perfectly, terrifyingly calm. At 8:41 p.m., Seokjin stood to give a longer address, The formal one, the one with the printed remarks he had rehearsed. The one that was supposed to mark the official launch of the Adaeze joint venture and be recorded for the internal announcement video. He spoke for 6 minutes. He outlined the history of the partnership. He named 4 people by name and role. He did not name Adaeze. He did not name her once. And look, if you think you know where this is going, I need you to stay right here and stay with the story, because what walks through that door in 6 minutes is not what you're expecting, and the look on Seok-jin's face when it happens is something that no amount of prepared remarks is going to help him recover from. Comment right now, are you on Adaeze's side, or do you think she should have just walked away? Tell me below, because this next part is going to split this entire comment section in half. The doors opened at 8:47 p.m.
No knock.
The doors simply opened, both of them, simultaneously. The way doors open when the person walking through them has never in their life needed to knock, has never operated in spaces where knocking was required of them, has moved through the world in that particular frequency of assurance that does not announce itself because it does not need to. The man who walked in was not tall in the way that demands attention. He was still in the way that commands it. Dark suit, no tie, the particular unhurried energy of a man who has decided that rooms will adjust to him rather than the other way around, and rooms, historically, had agreed. His name was Adeyemi Oluwaseun Babatunde, 34. Founding partner of Adeyemi Capital. The man whose family name was on the building they were currently eating in. The man who had married Adaeze Chukwu 4 months ago in a private ceremony in Abuja attended by 40 people and covered by absolutely nobody, because Son did not perform his life for an audience. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and the room processed him. And then every man at that table stood up. Not together. It moved like a wave, the recognition traveling from one end to the other as each person understood who they were looking at, and the standing happened the way standing happens when it is not planned and not performative but simply involuntary, the body's honest response to the entrance of someone whose weight in a room is impossible to ignore. The 2 senior Hanwha executives at the far end rose first. Then the men beside them. Then Juno, sharply, the chair scraping back. Then one by one down the length of the table until the wave reached Seok-jin, who had stopped speaking mid-sentence, his printed remark still in his hand, and who was now standing not because he wanted to but because every other man in the room was standing and the alternative was to remain seated alone, which is a statement no man in his position could afford to make in front of 9 witnesses. Chaerin looked up at Seok-jin. His face was doing something complicated. Son walked into the room without hurrying. He scanned the table once, the efficient, total scan of a man who misses nothing, and his eyes found Adaeze at the far end, in the seat by the kitchen door, in the wine-red dress, with her fork still in her hand, and something in his expression shifted in a way that was visible only if you were watching closely, which Adaeze was, and which Seok-jin unfortunately also was. It was not a dramatic shift. It was not movie moment eye contact across a crowded room. It was quieter than that, and therefore more devastating. The simple, private recognition between 2 people who have chosen each other, crossing a space full of other people who are only now beginning to understand what they are witnessing. Son walked the length of the table, past the Hanwha executives, past the board members, past the men who were still half standing, uncertain whether to sit, watching him move. He reached the far end, the kitchen door end, the dishwater smell end, the seat that someone had decided was the appropriate place for the woman who built the entire evening, and he pulled out the empty chair beside Adaeze and sat down. In the seat at the end of the table, at the same end as his wife. The room did not know what to do with this. You could feel it, the collective recalibration, 9 men simultaneously running the same calculation and arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. Adeyemi Oluwaseun Babatunde, who could have sat anywhere, had chosen to sit at the disgraced end of the table, which meant the disgraced end of the table was no longer the disgraced end, which meant whoever had designed this seating arrangement had made a catastrophic error in judgment, because they had put the wrong woman in exile. Seok-jin sat back down slowly. "You're late," Adaeze said to Son quietly. "I'm exactly on time," he said. "Your timing has always been a character flaw." It resolved itself. He glanced at the table. "You haven't eaten your main." "I was waiting." "I told you not to wait. I do what I want, Son." He looked at her then, fully the way he looked at things he had decided to keep. And the quiet in that look was the kind of quiet that has mass and heat and history in it. Then he picked up her fork from where she had set it, turned it once in his hand, and set it back down in front of her.
Eat, he said.
She almost smiled. She picked up the fork. Juno, across the table, was watching this exchange with the expression of a man who is rapidly reassembling a situation he thought he understood. One of the Hanwell executives, the older one, Choi Man-soo, who had been in the industry for 30 years and had the particular radar of someone who has survived that long by reading rooms accurately, leaned toward his colleague and said something in Korean that Adaeze caught clearly because she always caught Korean clearly. The wife. That is his wife. The one who built this deal. His colleague looked at Adaeze. Then at Seokjin. Then back at Adaeze. Seokjin was very still. Chaerin touched his arm. He did not respond. Sohn had flagged down one of the serving staff and was quietly requesting that 2 additional place settings be brought to this end of the table, along with whatever the main course was, and also water. Still, no ice, because Adaeze had once mentioned in passing that she did not like ice in her water, and that was the kind of thing Sohn filed away, and did not forget. You re-registered the venture terms, Seokjin said. The table went quiet. He had not meant to say it loudly. Or perhaps he had. Either way, it landed in the silence between the background noise of the restaurant, sharp and public, and every person at that table heard it. Sohn looked up from the menu card he had been reading.
I'm sorry.
The joint venture filing. Seokjin's voice was controlled, but only barely, the control of a man gripping something that is trying to get away from him. The equity structure was amended 3 days ago. The amended filing names Adaeze Capital as primary stakeholder with 71% controlling interest. That is not what we agreed. It is exactly what we agreed, Sohn said pleasantly. In the original terms. Before your legal team submitted a counterstructure in February that quietly moved 11% of Adaeze's stake into a Hanwell subsidiary without notifying our side. A silence. That amendment, Sohn continued, in the same pleasant tone, was flagged to me by our chief strategy officer in March. We gave your team 60 days to correct it voluntarily. You did not. So we corrected it ourselves. He picked up his water glass. The filing is clean. Our lawyers have confirmed. Choi Man-soo, the senior Hanwell executive, had gone very still. He was looking at Seokjin with an expression that was not quite anger, and not quite something else, something worse. The look of a man who is realizing that a subordinate has made a decision on his behalf that he was not informed of, which in Korean corporate culture is not a minor thing. It is a structural betrayal. Seokjin, Choi said quietly. Sir, I can explain. The February amendment. Choi's voice had the particular flatness of a man choosing his words in public when what he wants to do is have a very different conversation in private. This is the first I am hearing of it. It was a standard. It was not standard. Adaeze spoke for the first time since Sohn had sat down. Not loudly. She did not need volume. She had spent 11 months learning what it felt like to speak and not be heard, and she had made a decision somewhere in that process that when she spoke again, it would be in the kind of voice that did not require a room to be quiet first. It would create its own quiet. The February amendment was a unilateral restructure of an agreement that took 9 months to negotiate. It was submitted on the 14th of February through a subsidiary entity that did not exist when the original terms were signed, which means it was created specifically to execute this transaction without triggering our right of notice clause. She paused. I found it because I read everything. I always read everything. That was always the problem, wasn't it, Seokjin? It was not a question. Seokjin looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt and not quite fury, the specific compound emotion of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone he dismissed, which is its own particular kind of unbearable. You, he said, and then stopped. Me. Adaeze agreed. Chaerin was looking between them with the dawning expression of a woman who has walked into a story already in progress and is only now finding the first page. Her hand dropped from Seokjin's arm. Subscribe right now if you can see exactly what Adaeze has been doing this entire time, because the wine-red dress, the seat at the end of the table, the waiting, none of it was passivity, every single second of it was strategy. And the ending of this story is going to make your jaw drop. You did this, Sukjin said. His voice had dropped. You restructured the filing to punish me. I restructured the filing, Adaeze said, to correct a fraud. That is not. Sukjin. Choi Mansu's voice cut across the table like a blade. One word. Just his name. In Korean, at that pitch, from that man, it meant stop talking. It meant you have already done enough. It meant we will discuss the rest of this privately, and you should be afraid of that conversation. Sukjin stopped talking. The silence at the table had a texture now. You could feel the weight of the realignment happening in real time, 9 people recalculating, reassigning value and threat and significance. Understanding that the woman at the far end of the table in the seat by the kitchen door had not been exiled to that seat. She had been positioned there, quietly, like a piece on a board that everyone mistook for a pawn until the moment it reached the other side. Juno was looking at Adaeze with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It took her a moment to identify it. It was something adjacent to awe. Mrs. Adeyemi, Choi Mansu said, and the title landed differently now, weighted with the recalibration, with the understanding that this woman's name on a company was not a social appendage, but a structural fact. I would like to formally request a meeting. Hanwol Group. Our office is in Seoul, at your earliest convenience. Of course, Adaeze said. My office will be in touch. My office. The 2 words sat in the air for a moment. Sukjin picked up his wine glass and set it back down without drinking. Sharon reached up and touched the pearls at her throat. It was an unconscious gesture, the fingertips going to the necklace the way they do when you suddenly become aware of something you are wearing, when it shifts from jewelry to object, from decoration to question. She looked at the pearls in the way of someone who has been handed something in the dark and is only now seeing it in the light. She looked at Sukjin. He did not look back at her. Those belong to me, Adaeze said, and she said it gently, not as accusation, not as performance, just as fact, the way you state a fact about the weather or the time. They were a gift from his mother. She gave them to me. I left them by mistake. Charon's hand dropped from the necklace. You can keep them for tonight, Adaeze said. She picked up her wine glass. I'll arrange for them to be collected. The dining room was so quiet that you could hear the kitchen behind the doors at the far end. Son, beside Adaeze, was reading the menu card again with the expression of a man who is finding it genuinely interesting, which was such a precise and deliberate performance of calm that Adaeze wanted to laugh, would have laughed. In another version of this evening in another life. Instead, she drank her wine. The announcement video, one of the Adeyemi board members said carefully, from his position midway down the table. The one we were recording for the internal launch. Should we continue with the address, or? Everyone looked at Sukjin. Sukjin was looking at the middle distance. His printed remarks were still on the table beside his plate, the paper slightly bent at the corner where he had gripped it. I think, Son said pleasantly, setting down the menu card, that my wife should give the address. Another silence. She wrote the deal, he said, with the simple directness of stating an obvious thing. She negotiated the terms. She identified the February irregularity and corrected it. She is the Chief Strategy Officer of Adeyemi Capital. He looked at the table. It seems logical. Choi Mansu nodded once. The nod of a man who has made a rapid and total reassessment and is not going to pretend otherwise. Adaeze set down her wine glass. She looked at Son. He was not looking at her. He was pouring her water, no ice, exactly as requested, with the focused attention of a man performing an act of care so quiet it could only be seen by someone who was paying attention. She had married him, in part, because he paid attention. She stood up. The chair did not scrape. She rose cleanly, smoothed the front of her wine-red dress once, and looked down the length of the table at the men who were already turning toward her, recalibrating, realigning, and at Sukjin, who finally looked at her, who could not stop looking at her, whose face was doing something raw and unguarded that she had not seen on it in years, maybe ever, the face beneath the face, the one that knew exactly what it had thrown away. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she looked away from him and addressed the table. The Hanwol Adeyemi joint venture, she said, began as a conversation between 2 old men who trusted each other. Her voice was even and warm and carried without effort. It became something larger than that because of the people in this room who understood what it could be. I want to thank the Hanwol team for their commitment, their patience, and their integrity, particularly Chairman Choi, whose standard of conduct throughout this process has been consistent and exemplary. She paused. I want to acknowledge that the path to this table was not always straight. Some things were said and done along that path that I will not pretend did not happen. She did not look at Seokjin. She did not need to. But we are here. The deal is clean. The structure is sound. And what we build from this point belongs to everyone who is willing to do the work honestly. She raised her glass. To honest work, she said. The table raised their glasses. All of them. Every man at that table, including Juno, who looked like he might need a moment, including the board members who had flown from Lagos, including Choi Man-soo, who nodded once again with the gravity of someone who has seen many rooms and is acknowledging that this one is one of the rare ones, including Son, from the far end, from the kitchen door end, from the seat that was supposed to be exile and had instead become the most powerful position in the room, who raised his glass and looked at his wife with the same quiet, private recognition he had worn when he walked in, the look that belonged only to the two of them. Seokjin raised his glass last. His hand was not quite steady. And if you have been here from the beginning, if you stayed from the pearls to the end of this table, from the name card stripped of its title to the moment that room stood up, then you already know that Adaeze Chukwu did not come to that dinner to fight. She came because the building had her name on it, and she wanted to see what happened when a man who had decided she was finished finally met the version of her that had been waiting, quietly, for exactly this moment. Comment below, what was the moment you knew Adaeze had already won before anyone else in that room did? Was it the seating chart? The filing? Or was it the dress? Subscribe right now if you believe that real power never announces itself, it simply arrives. Like button if Adaeze deserved every single second of that room. And come back next week, because the story we are telling next makes this one look like a warm-up. You do not want to miss what is coming.